Checkmate. It's good. Good game, Tim.
Thanks.
Almost. We might talk a little about your chess playing ability. You're quite good, and you play with a purpose, an important purpose. Welcome to In the Stacks by the Sea. And I'm your host, Dan Turner. We're here at the Waccamaw Library, part of the Georgetown County Library System here in South Carolina. And we are in the stacks by the sea with Tim Conroy. He is the brother of beloved novelist Pat Conroy and a writer in his own right. He's the author of Theologies of Terrain and is an educator who, this is not his first time here. You are a repeat offender, a main offender and a repeat offender. You keep coming back. We keep asking you to come back here, Tim, and you keep falling for the trick. But we love having you here. You're back again to see us. And this time you're going to be talking about family troubles and how to produce great writing from out of all that turmoil.
Well, speaking of turmoil, I love being in the library because it reminds me of when we were kids, the safe place we could go. When things got chaotic at home, when Dad was you knew on edge for whatever reason, we could go to the library and it would be safe, and we'd be surrounded by ways we could escape the bad things at home. We could open up a book and we could go into another world, and that's what we were taught to do.
We had a wonderful presentation a few weeks ago by Bill Oberst Jr., this wonderful actor who grew up right here in Georgetown County, and he was been performing in this one-man show as Ray Bradbury, and Bradbury had the same experience. That he said, libraries raised me.
Yeah.
You know, that was the safe haven, and I know you spoke to that and your brother, and there really is that need out there for a place to go away from home, and and books can. It's not just a place to go and just stare at the walls for.
And it's so nice is
hour.
Librarians getting to know you as kids, and then they know what you're interested in reading, and all of a sudden you walk in and they hand you a book and say, I think you might like this one. And it's just it's always when I'm in a library or an independent bookstore, I think I'm in what keeps civilization alive.
I mean, that's absolutely the case, and we have the last person on In the Stacks by the Sea, Sarah Gardner, was talking about what Civil War soldiers were reading in camp, and her basic thesis was this is what they were fighting for. They were fighting for reading. That was civilization to them. That's what kept them sane.
That's great.
And that's it was. Their values were in those books, Charles Dickens and Shakespeare and all that. That's what kept them sane and human. And so libraries matter. It's important. And we got a wonderful children's librarian sitting right over there across the way, Amy King, and Ashley, her assistant librarian, who they will bring the children in and they will get you going with some reading materials. And all our librarians are aiming to do that, and they're just worlds waiting to be discovered here. So that was your experience in libraries growing up, and you became, as I said, you're a poet, but you were an educator as a career for most of your life. Can you tell us something about that?
And I know you've heard this story, but I mean the story is I really denied my writing. I said, no to my writing. Where I had an older brother, Pat Conroy, who was an amazing novelist who early on knew he wanted to be a writer. In fact, he wanted to be a poet. I had an older sister, Carol, who wanted to be a poet more than anything else. So, I don't know if I've ever told you the story about how I ended up as an educator. And the way that happened was one summer, of course, after saying no to writing and just ruling that out, one summer I worked at a camp. And this camp was up by Clemson. And this camp was for and designed for children with emotional disabilities. And it was a sort of a wilderness experience where we would take kids out backpacking for 3 or 4 days at a time, and kids would cooperate to set up their tents and cook their meals and work together. And so we would do that. The second day of camp, we had to give the kids a swim test. And it was my job to line the kids up to say, could you swim? And if you can swim, stand over here. If you can't swim, wait on the shore. So I took the swimmers, we lined them up at the dock. We had lifeguards in the water. And the kids walked one at a time to the end of the dock. They jumped in and swam back with the lifeguards. Well, I had asked this one kid, Nate, whether he could swim. And Nate said yes, he could swim. And I had taken a special interest the first day because Nate was from St. Helena Island. And so he was near Beaufort. I knew his geography, I knew his terrain, and he was this quiet kid, but he had this quality about him, this silent strength. So when it was Nate's turn to go swimming, he walked out to the end of the dock and he leapt off the end. He sank like an anchor. And we all panicked. The lifeguards somersaulted into the water, got his armpits, and side-stroked him back to shore. They get him to shore. And what do I do as I'm a 19, 20-year-old kid? And I'm angry. My first reaction is really I'm scared. I know what could have happened. I know the consequence that could have happened. It didn't happen. But I'm over Nate. I'm looming over this kid who's dripping wet, and I'm saying, Nate, why didn't you tell me you couldn't swim? And Nate said the words that made me a teacher. He said, I didn't know. I didn't know I couldn't swim. And so I was stunned by that answer and realized, of course you didn't know, Nate. I didn't ask you enough questions. I didn't ask you the right questions. I was the adult that was supposed to take care of you, and I failed you, Nate. I promise you I won't do that again all summer. You promised to tell me what you can't do and what you can do, and I called him the rest of the summer Fearless Nate. And from that day on, I knew with clarity I wanted to become a teacher, and I tried to become the best teacher I could become.
Yeah, that's you had never told me that story. That's an amazing story, and that is. And you can tell what kind of teacher you were, as a career, but you continue to be a teacher and an educator, even though officially you served your time and retired. But I think what you're doing now, going around the state, what you're doing here, coming back to visit us here and elsewhere around, that's education as well, but you can see the passion for it, and what kids, not just kids but us, us old folks, but we don't know what we don't know. That's life, and learning from others.
It's so one important. Of the barriers of life I think we all have is we assume stuff, and we don't. We often assume stuff about the other incorrectly. Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of the life lesson of getting to know somebody on a deeper level. Yeah. And
you're going around. You're doing outreach, education programs, reading. You're doing readings and workshops. You're going to do a poetry writing workshop tomorrow for us. So could you say a little bit about this sort of second life, second career that you embarked on?
It surprises me more than anybody that, first of all, that the collection of poetry came out and even emerged. And I think it came out because of the sort of the love that my brother Pat and my sister Carol, really they urged me to write most of my life, and I said no to it. And Carol would write me these beautiful letters saying, here's who you should be reading. Now, I secretly read those people, but I just never took the other step. And I always denied that part of me. My brother Pat, 3 years before he dies, he sends his Citadel friend Sam Morton to my door. And he knocks on my door, and Sam invites me to join his writing group called the Ink Plots, and fabulous people. And so I joined that group, and it was the first time I said yes to that secret desire that I had suppressed. And so, we know, I think most people know that Pat died March 4th, 2016. So he never gets to see the publication of this book. But, in my mind, this book would have never happened without him and my older sister's encouragement. And so it's a gift that I do not take lightly, to be able to go around. And it's such a joy, Daniel, as you know, to read something that you've created to an audience of people is a privilege and a joy.
Yeah, and that book came out, Theologies of Terrain, in 2017 from Muddy Ford Press, and it is, it is something. Is it nerve-wracking? You would think to get up there and have to read poems. It's a crowd. It's a new thing. I mean, you've stood in front of classrooms before, so it's not the public speaking thing, but it's a different kind of feeling.
It's a different thing, but I tell you, the reason I don't get nervous because, and I think this is a simple reason why. I think as you get older, it makes sense. I've seen so much loss and pain that I don't, to me, this is just it's a surge of energy and joy when I get up and read. And it's there's nothing, I want to pick my words carefully. I want to say something to people that have taken time to come to see me, the audience, and I want to share information with them and share things with them that we can help each other out. And I think part of it is the clarity of loss that we all share. In this age where we're going through this political climate in this time where we seem so pitted against each other, the things I see is how much we have in common with the complexity of our lives that we have with each other. And that's what I want to talk about, and that's what I want to ground myself in with my poetry, and that's what I want to explore.
It's, I think really, something that I've seen you read and conduct workshops and talk about your brother's work. You talked about Pat Conroy's great love of poetry last time you were here, but it's not about you. That sort of it's about something higher and a larger purpose, and it is about art and about literature and about reading and all these deeper things, and
it's about going in that library and opening the book and illuminating the human spirit through the words on that page. And there's nothing better. And it's not, to me, when I read great poetry, and I know when you read great poetry, sometimes you read these poems that poets have written, and you say, I did not know poetry could do that. And you're so taken in by somebody who has crafted a poem, and it's seemingly the message is to you sometimes. And whether it's a narrative poem or a lyrical poem or a ballad or whatever it is.
Yeah. And it's not, poetry, is it really good poetry? Is it meant to be, or shouldn't be, it shouldn't be a matter of division. It shouldn't be off-putting. It should be something that we should all share in. It should show us what we have in common. in unique ways.
You know, it's funny because sometimes you can see people, wives or husbands, somebody has dragged their spouse to a poetry reading, and the other partner doesn't want to really be there. And what I want to make people feel so comfortable about poetry, because once you find, it's sort of like music. Once you find the music you love, whether it's country or jazz or blues, you love that music, or rock. Poetry's the same way. Find the poetry that speaks to you, and you'll love it forever.
There's so many different varieties, so many, probably more people writing poetry on earth today than ever before, and there's some really, really good stuff out there. So, you know, you will find your style. You will find something out there, and you might be inspired to write it as well, just like you were. And after years and years and years of saying the great no, 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 despite the urging of, you know, some pretty powerful people, your sister Carol, a very highly respected poet, and of course your brother Pat.
You know, Carol I love to talk about because people don't know Carol. Her first collection earned her a fellowship with the University of Virginia, the Jewish Furrier. 2 of those poems would be published in the Paris Review. She would go on and write her collection, The Beauty Wars, which was published by a major publisher, Norton. And I'm telling you, every Christmas season, I would get a stack of poetry books from Carol, from a bookstore in the East Village in New York City, and with this letter of who I must read. And she never let me deny myself. She was going to harass. I had a brother and a sister who harassed me until I would say yes. And really, to explain the great yes, is it goes back to a poem by a 20th century Greek poet, C.P. Cavafy. And the poem has this wonderful dark message, foreboding message, maybe challenging message, that to certain people there comes a day when they must say the great yes or the great no. Those that are ready to reveal themselves will say the great yes. Those that won't will say the great no. The poem goes on to say, basically, if given the chance, if you said no the first time, if given the chance again, you would say no again. And yet that no crushes you for the rest of your life. What a message. And they would tease each other about, as kids, who's going to say the great yes? I'm going to say the great yes. You're going to say the great no. And, you know, both of them truthfully said yes to that ridiculous dream. Both of them wanted to be poets. And both of them had a ridiculous dream of becoming poets and writers. And you have to start with the dream. And then what they did, Daniel, is they worked every day to read the thousands of books, of good books, thousands of good books of poetry, thousands of good books of literature that you have to read. They became word collectors. They learned their craft, and they took it seriously to make that dream happen.
Yeah, the short version of saying the great yes, YOLO.
Yeah.
You only live once.
Yeah.
Why not? Go for it. But it does take a lot of work, and from every writer I've heard, they say read, read, read. You want to be a writer? You better get yourself a library card and start, get in here and inhabit those worlds that are made out of words.
And Pat was the same way with it. Kind of take that with his athletics. He was not physically gifted, but yet he earned a college scholarship in basketball because he practiced every day. He took that same sort of ferocity that he had as an athlete and discipline to his writing life, and he worked really, really hard.
Yeah, that's got to have the inspiration, but also have to have the perspiration, as they say.
And I think God loves fools that have big dreams. I just do. I think, regardless of what your faith is, whether it's karma, whether you have a Christian viewpoint, whether you don't, whatever it is, I think somehow the universe likes the creature that has a huge dream, and then the creature that works for it.
Yeah. And it's a beautiful if it fails, it's a beautiful failure. So you can move on and build something out of the remnants of that broken dream.
How can reading a book be a failure though?
Yeah.
When you learn,
build
how can you, when you build a skill, or you read, or you improve in some area, or the joy of language, none of that equates. It becomes how you define success.
Yeah.
Now, Carol didn't have great financial success, but I mean, she didn't define it that way.
Right. Yeah. Well, you've been talking about your family, and it is growing up Conroy. You lived in interesting times, as the old proverb goes. May you live in interesting times. Not always good times, for sure, and that's part of what you're going to talk about both tomorrow morning with talking about family secrets and family truths, writing out of the shadow of the great Santini. So it was an abusive family unit that you had to grow up in, but there was some room there that you had to create to try to work your way into something better, or to adjust, or somehow accommodate yourself to that.
Yeah, I think anything, I think any family, and I don't want to generalize to other families, other kids that have gone through abusive backgrounds, but I think what is true, that you have periods of time where it seems pretty normal, where there's normalcy in the dynamic, and then what's different is the times where it becomes violent, and all of a sudden it could just snap. And so I had a father who, and I don't think it was unique to us, because we were military brats, and I think a lot of fathers who came back from war zones had a tough time adjusting. My father had a tough time adjusting just to, basically everything became sort of a military sort of metaphor. We were just an extension of the Marine Corps to him. And so, I mean, and so we were raised in that sort of style, and he would cross the line often, so.
Yeah. Do you feel that it was your drive to write, do you feel that was something that was just an internal calling of some kind, or do you feel that was a direct response to growing up in that kind of abusive and militaristic household?
I know this sort of Wallace Stevens, Seamus Heaney paraphrasing Wallace Stevens quote, imagination presses back against the violence of the world. And I think, in terms of Carol and Pat, and later me, I think that is true. I think we fled into our imagination a lot. And I think even when you read, what I love is when I reread The Great Santini for this presentation, watching Pat sort of explore how the characters of Ben Meacham and Marianne would sort of flee into their, Pat towards the end would call it kind of going behind his eye. And also Pat, the character that Pat wrote, Ben Meacham, felt shame and guilt for wanting his father dead, for wanting his father not to return from war. But he just didn't want his mom to be beat. He didn't want the character of his mom to be beat. And that happened in our lives. That was really what was going on. And so here's the thing about life and fiction and the miracles that sometimes happen. When Pat wrote The Great Santini, Dad was furious because all of a sudden, through this fiction, through this fictional character, Dad's abuse was being exposed to the world. And although Dad, to his dying day, denied it, when faced with the truth and faced with that reality, he began to change and became a better grandparent to Pat's kids and became a better father to us. And that would have never happened without the courage of Pat writing that book and telling the truth. And sometimes when you face things head on, like Pat did, which I think great literature does, right? Great literature is when having a writer be able to tell something that's so hard to describe and tell, some truth so essential that it connects with people. Pat did that.
Yeah,
and saved my father. Saved my father.
I mean, it's an amazing story that it's fiction, technically, and it is made up, and yet it's head on. It changes reality. How strong that fiction is, even though it's through a lens. It's technically not reality, but it changes.
When Pat
reality.
submitted the first 4 chapters to Houghton Mifflin, to his editor Ann Barrett, Ann Barrett writes Pat back and says, "This character, Bull Meacham, he has no redeeming qualities. Nobody's going to believe him." And Pat goes, "Well, I'm sorry, that's really true to life. He didn't have many redeeming qualities." And Ann Barrett insisted he put in key places in the book some things that made the character a little bit more likable. So Pat, in order to write that book, had to in fact lie and make Dad better. So,
and it had an effect in your immediate family, a positive effect, but also for how many thousands, thousands upon thousands who read that book, and there was kind of a sea change out there.
But do you know the story how he got the idea to write that book?
No, tell us.
It's I guess The Water is Wide, when he published that book. It was 1972, to put you in time. So 1972, we're living as a family back in Beaufort. Mom is retiring to Beaufort. Unknown to Dad, 2 years later, Mom would ask and file for a divorce from Dad in 1974. But in 1972, Mom, like any mom, was so proud of Pat for The Water is Wide. And so she asked Pat to speak at the Officers Club. And so Pat spoke, addressed a room full of Marine officers. And instead of talking about what he was supposed to talk about, which is The Water is Wide, he talked about military wives should not put up with their husband's abuse, should not let their husbands hit their kids. And half the room was furious with Pat for doing that. Half the room was amazed and thankful and thanked him for that. And that talk in 1972 gave him the first inkling of writing the story.
That's amazing. Yeah. Well, it's incredible, the effect. Well, and you mentioned The Water is Wide as well. The effects of that book, and we often don't give novels that kind of credence anymore, and certainly poems. Percy Shelley back in the day, I think 1822 or thereabouts, he said poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, and now we just kind of, poets are just kind of unacknowledged anymore, and we're missing them, and especially given the divisiveness in politics today. I think we could have some folks who are paying attention to that, what you call the clarity of loss, and calling us together and paying attention to what we hold in common a little bit better. But but there are those powerful experiences that we can get from the written word.
Absolutely.
And it's you mentioned your mother, and we focus a lot about some of the other family dynamics with the Conroys. What about your mother's role?
Man, that's a complicated question. I often ask people, whether in Pat's books, when you think about The Prince of Tides and you think about the Great Santini, is Pat more father-haunted or more mother-haunted? And then, of course, you're asking me that question, and I'd rather deflect. I loved my mother so much. She was such a protector. But I want to tell you this. She was pretty wore out by the time I got to be in high school. I was the second to the youngest. And so, by the time I got around, let me put you in time of this story. I told you that my mother and father would end up separating in around 1974. 1975, I would start my freshman year at the University of South Carolina. And at that point in time, my mother and father, I think their divorce went final in 76, something like that. So I'll tell you a story. And this is a story of coming to Carolina with my mother to get dropped off. And she had asked a friend, Pete Sauger, to drive us up. And Pete and her dropped me off on Pendleton Street where the housing place was, housing for USC. And they waited, they parked outside, and I ran into the building. And the woman said, behind the counter, she looked me up, looked my name up, and said, "Tim, you're on a waiting list for a dorm room. It's going to be about maybe 2-3 weeks." And so I ran outside with my 2 Samsonite, those hard case suitcases. And my mom looked at me and said, "Oh, they'll work it out." Well, I said, "Mom, I'm not sure whether they can work it out, but you sure?" "Yeah, oh yeah, they'll work it out." And so they drive off, heading back to Beaufort. So I run back in. This is 1975. There's no cell phones. I run back in, and the lady goes, "What?" She said, "We'll work it out." "That's not working it out. We're on a waiting list. We can't do anything." So I'm like, "Oh, great." And so I have my 2 suitcases, and I'm a military brat. I'm not without some sort of sense. Like on the way into town, I spotted some places, and near where that housing place was on Pendleton, I had spotted what I thought was a bar. Well, I'm taking my suitcases. I'm walking to the nearest bar to figure this out. So I go into at that time, this place was called the Campus Club. And I go in with my 2 pathetic, hard, suitcases. And they were green, spotted, splotchy green. And the bartender looks at me. I'm 17. I'm not even 18. And he looks at me and goes, "What do you want?" And I explain what just happened. And he goes, "God, that's the worst story I've ever heard." And he buys me a beer. And so I'm sitting at the bar stool.
It's tough coming from a bartender.
Yeah, and he introduces me to everybody who walks in that he knows. And he gets me a place on Green Street in a house for the next 2.5 weeks before I get a dorm room. Now, it's not a bedroom. It's actually a foyer. And the people in the house are giving me pillows and blankets, and I end up, that's my introduction to Carolina. But I tell you that story, that's how worn out my mom was. That's how dysfunctional my family was. And that's my interest. And when I actually see parents, good, normal people, lovingly move in their kids, I'm like, God, that's so wonderful. It's so great. But it wasn't my story.
Right. Yeah. And you should see where they're moving them into as well. Everyone has the dorm rooms are so much nicer than than any. It's like a beautiful downtown Manhattan spread that the dorm rooms at South Carolina now. They're moving into these kids.
But in defense, and I would say that's sort of my mom's indictment. In defense of her, she was driven crazy by the violence of my father. And so that's the flip side. I certainly understand. You know, what the tragedy of that is, to me now, is she died, Daniel, when she was 59. After the divorce, she only had about 8 years. And she remarried a really gentle, nice guy who was a naval doctor, but she only had a very short time to really enjoy that.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the sad thing, because I would have loved to see what sort of woman she could become with a normal person to live with.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that just being worn down and worn out, that's and you did make it. You made it through. You were kind of thrown into the fire there, and that is.
Oh, it's just
sad,
part of my story,
and
you know, and I think part of the theme of my collection of poetry is how the stranger has saved me, and there's been many times where I have been rescued by the love of a stranger.
Yeah. And that's part of your quality is you pay it back, you pay it forward. And we were talking about chess, but I know you play chess with a neighbor.
Yeah, right? I play. You know, my book, Theologies of Terrain. The cover of that book is the photograph was taken by a neighbor who's a professor of photography, Kathleen Robbins. And I was completely enamored by her book, Into the Flatland, this beautiful collection of photographs of the Mississippi Delta. And in fact, one of my poems in this book is called Theology of Terrain, and it's written in response to her photographs and her friend's photographs, Vaughn Schuler Clay. And you know, once you get into viewing their monographs of these books of their photographs, Maud's book Delta Dogs, and Kathleen's books, they just take you into this terrain, which is, the horizon is so big, and in the perspective of your human smallness, of how small we are, is so evident in that sort of geography. And I wanted to capture that and try to capture that in a poem. And so, anyway, as the magic of life never ceases to amaze me, is after Pat died, Kathleen asked me to read that very poem at the Columbia Museum of Art. And so the curators converted the poem into about a 6-foot poem on the wall, about the size of my brother Pat. This was a couple months after Pat. Pat had died on March 4th. By the way, the person Pat sent to my door, Sam Morton, died 1 month after Pat. So both these really significant people I had lost. So I'm reading this poem at the Museum of Art in Columbia. It goes well. Kathleen's photographs are magical. They're beautiful. I'm thinking of Pat. I walk down the hallway and I go into the main exhibit room, and in that room there is photographs by Jean Mutasami Ash in her exhibit Dufusky Memories. So all these photographs of Dufusky Island, iconic memories. I'm just like looking at them saying, Pat, you know, what are you doing to me right now? And I'm thinking of him and reminiscing as you do. And I look in the middle of the room, there's a plexiglass case, and I walk over to it. And in that glass case, the curators had borrowed Pat's original manuscript, handwritten on legal pad, of The Water is Wide. And I'm thinking, this is not happening. This is, it was just one of those moments where I knew Cafafy, the great yes, everything had come together for that moment. Well, what happens with Kathleen, to go to your question about chest, is the next summer last summer. Last summer, in fact, her husband, the great, kind Ben Madden, who is he's a jogger. He worked out. He was just a great neighbor. He would go across the street to the elderly neighbor's house, Gloria, cut her grass, clean her gutters, just one of those guys. He goes to work out. Kathleen gets a call and learns he's died from a heart attack. So Ben had been teaching Asher to play chess, and Asher's a very good chess player. And so now, when Asher allows, I go over there and play chess with Asher. And Asher and Kathleen are two of the most amazing, strong people I've ever met in my life.
Yeah.
I'm a little. I go on forever, so you got to cut me off.
No. You can tell. You got the storytelling gene.
That's just
well.
Irish.
You can yeah.
This is even
spin
without
the
a beer.
yarns. Well, we've got some good places across the street for beers. If you know, after the show, the screening of The Great Santini, which you're going to introduce, you'll spin some yarns before that too. But these are great yarns, great tales. But you tell your tales in a different way, and I think that's it's an interesting thing, because you obviously have the ability to give these narratives and about family history and your own history, and they're always, they're not really about you, but they tend to reach out towards and include others. But your main form is poetry, and why do you think do you choose that form, or did that form choose you? Do you think why poetry?
I don't know exactly. Yeah. I don't know if I could say. I just know that affinity, the love of poetry, of reading poetry, came early, and I know that you have these moments in life I'll never forget. And you're a Mary Oliver fan. You love her poetry, and I have key moments in my life where things happen where I would get calls from people, and they would comfort me with poetry or poems, and I remember living in McCullenville at the time in August 31st, 1994. I get a call that morning, and it's from my brother Mike, who tells me that my brother Tom, my youngest brother Tom, has committed suicide. He has jumped off a building in Columbia, and Tom suffered for 13 years from the onset of schizophrenia. He suffered from that. It was sort of an episodic roller coaster of these episodes where the symptoms would be really, really intense, and he would be very, very paranoid, and he would have delusions and hear voices, and then things would be much better, and he'd be able to hold jobs, but it was a roller coaster for him. And I think he finally just gave up. But anyway, it tore our family apart with grief. Another reason I'm not nervous about anything. When you're faced with that sort of grief, things don't matter. And there was nobody in the world I was closer to than Tom. And Pat would call, and part of our conversations about family would be about poetry, and he'd read poems to me. And he definitely, one of the poems he would read was the Mary Oliver Wild Geese poem. But Tom was a great kid. I don't want to be. It's one of those things. I'll tell you a good story to sort of maybe the importance of women in my life, and the importance of my wife. One of the things when I left being the assistant principal at Andrews Elementary School, and I was moving back to Columbia, one of the things I told and confided in with my wife Terry was the thing I'm most worried about was I was going to have to park in a parking lot that was very close to walk into the South Carolina Department of Education. That was very close. It was, in sight, very close to where Tom had jumped off this apartment building, leapt off, and so she said, "Tim, don't worry about it. We'll work out a strategy, a plan." And so she was going back to get her degree in getting her master's in library science. She is, I would not marry any other person except a librarian. How's that? Yes.
That's a great
and
plug.
I love her to death. And she said, at the time, in the bottom of this building, now they had created a bagel shop and a coffee place. And so she took my hand from the car, and she led me in there. And we would then have coffee and talk about Tom and invoke him back into our lives. Because sometimes you deny these people you love because of your grief instead of letting him come back in. And so I let Tom come back into my life. And Terry did that for me. And that was a gift. And so it became something from, instead of dreading it, Daniel, it became something that I looked forward to.
Yeah.
Because it was like, we will remember another Tom story.
And writing as well, I think, in your own writing, that you at first have this, and we've talked about this, privately before, but that power to withstand at first is part of the process.
The mediocrity, the failure. Yeah, the hours of just, it's not good. And everybody has to go through that process. And every day you try to get better. Every day you try to read somebody who's so much better than you. You want to give up, but you have to do it. You have to celebrate the works of great writers and learn from them and read great poems. And you have to sit down in a chair and fail every day until you can get to the good stuff.
And like you said, that's not failing.
Yeah.
I mean, you're reading great stuff, and you're strengthening yourself.
It is so
it's
much.
Imagining.
It is so much fun.
Sometimes it doesn't feel like saying the great yes. It
Yeah.
feels like saying the great, the great maybe, or the okay. The okay maybe, but it is saying the great yes, and you got to keep plugging along and keep going.
And you were nice enough to mention Muddy Ford Press, but Ed Madden was the editor, and Ed is the city of Columbia's poet laureate, and he was the nicest, kindest editor of my book in terms of the probing questions. And I'll tell you what he did for me, that if you're ever lucky enough to work with Ed Madden or an editor like Ed Madden, he'll read your work so deeply. He'll understand your work even more than you understand it sometimes. And so he was able to read my work with that level of depth and understanding, and it asked me the right questions to get me to look at ways to make it better.
I think Ed is he's at the University of South Carolina, faculty member, and he's also I think he was just recognized by the Academy of American Poets. So he's, as for his work as a poet laureate. So good company to be in there, and a good responsive editor. And would you? I was just fascinated with that. With what you were saying about dealing with trauma and personal trauma, and your brother, and using poetry to respond to that, which can be a tough form. But your brother used to say, "I was the son of a warrior." yeah, literally true, but there's also something, more figurative meaning behind that. That there's, I think
I think we have that. I think part of growing up with my father, we saw, we certainly learned and walked away with lessons about his insane courage. I mean, he was sort of, he was violent. He was a terrible father, but he could be likable. He was hilarious at times, and he became a better, gentler person. But his fierceness, you could see in life. I remember, I'll tell you a story, and I kind of walk away with this lesson, where he was trying to cash this check in a bank that he did not bank in, but I did. And I was a college student. He was going to try to leave me some money, which I appreciated. And the bank wouldn't cash his check. And he said, I can't repeat what he said, but he had this scene in the middle of the lobby of this bank. And I realized he's doing this all for show, it's on purpose, and he's having a ball. And he's not leaving until this check is cashed. And sure enough, he got this check cashed. And I thought, well, this is sort of a lesson about sometimes if you go so far against what the societal norms would expect you to do in a situation, because you just don't frankly care, you could sort of kind of get your way sometimes. And I think that was the lesson of being sort of the bravado of a fighter pilot. And I'll put it back to Pat a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, my father, got that nickname from this aerialist. How do you say that word? Aerialist. Aerialist.
Yes.
Thank you. That's a tongue twister. Yeah. When he was 6 at the circus, seeing this guy. And so my father, when he was flying a jet, doing the nose dives and the loops, he comes down and he says to, I guess, the group of people standing there, even the great Santini couldn't do that. And he was referring to this guy. And that name kind of stuck with him. Well, Pat would often talk about bravado with his writing. He would write on the high wire at high tide, and it was this same sort of bravado, but with different language.
Yeah.
And that, we had a game that we used to play called MLD, Most Like Dad. That was a most like dad moment for Pat.
Yeah, which was typically not a compliment.
Yeah,
as we know.
It was
but
very
in
derogatory.
this case,
Yes.
the courage to face those the darkness of the past.
You're saying this was an MLD moment for me.
The courage that you were talking about, that's the good side of being a son of a warrior. Is that you can go back and face and do it in an unusual form and a very different form, certainly from your brother who had the long sprawling sentences and plenty of space to work, and it's compressed, but you get a lot of personal history, but very relatively tight compressed form, and but a lot of deep emotional content, a lot of feeling plugged in there.
I think for going back to new writers, if you want to explore writing, one of the things that you can do is start with some strong emotion. What you feel strong about is a good place to start.
Would you take us out with a couple of, or choose a poem here? I'll put you on the spot, but would you read one? Because I do, you were talking about clarity of loss and something we hold in. It doesn't have to be clarity of loss poem, but something we hold in common. And I think people often say they don't understand poetry, and it's it's beyond them. But
I think people they
need to read.
I like this poem
your poems.
Because I can also call Kathleen Robbins again, because I need to thank her from the bottom of my heart. Mm-hmm. And this poem, Apertures, that I will read, was inspired by her. One day after Hurricane Joaquin, I don't know if y'all remember in Columbia, it rained for, it seemed like 6 weeks in a row. And it was just a huge flood event. Dams broke and houses and lives were ruined.
Very bad.
And after the rain stopped, I looked across the street and I was seeing cars pull up and bring boxes to Kathleen's porch. And Kathleen would walk them in. And I would see people pull up and run in hair dryers. And I was thinking, and I yelled to Terry, I said, Terry, what's going on at Kathleen's house? Being the nosy neighbor I am, I had to find out. So I walked over, and Kathleen had organized an effort to restore photographs that had been ruined in the flood.
Wow.
And it was amazing the process, painstakingly washing these photographs and trying to save them. She couldn't save them all. But when she did, and when that group of women that she had organized, and she wasn't the only organizer, there was other people, but when they did, they would wrap them up in tissue paper and give them back to that family. It was a beautiful effort. Apertures. In a soft composition of rain, then an outpouring of grand expanse, rising to the hackberry, overwhelming the new deck, we fled 1,000 years. When floodwaters recede, the flesh of home sullied and sick, we focus lenses to memories, cross thresholds as shadow and light. See the demarcation of chance, watermarks on walls above the ruin of below. Bone-dry oystermen in Savannah, wet muck on fresh in love faces, emulsion peeling layers of occasion from photos not worth another word. Toss albums into dumpsters, curse cameras from unlivable spaces, their apertures fixed to fate. Was it ever real, our trip to Italy, the wedding on the beach at Edisto? Stubbornly adhering to each other, no longer salvageable. Yeah, I just, Kathleen and that effort, they worked for weeks. And, I love when poems like that express, something people have done.
Yeah. That's, one of the things that people really embrace, after a storm like that, that's photographs are such a, especially the physical photographs, that's such an intimate part of our lives. And I know my wife Keegan, we got a hurricane.
Just imagine if you
packs.
lost those.
Oh yeah, they're gone.
It's just and literally in the restoration process, what would happen if at the very end, after you had the photos unstuck, after you washed them, after they dried for a while, sometimes you would see, you were thinking you had saved it, and all of a sudden the emulsion would peel across the photograph and the face would be gone
like a ghost.
of this wedding photograph.
Yeah.
And it was just, but anyway, the really short poem I'd like to read was inspired by Terry's grandmother, her mom, her sister, who are all no longer with us. They have all unfortunately passed. And Terry, they shared the southern succulent with each other from the root of her grandmother's hens and chicks. I don't know if you're familiar with that plant, but it's often common plant in the South. Hens and chicks, in this swirl of trouble, turn to your inheritance the clippings of sisterhood, grown in grief-watered soil, pap for the driest times, poised on pickets and tins, perched next to foundations, on ledges in terracotta, clustering in tight-lipped resolve, rallying to you again and again, blooming, perishing, a descendancy of tough rosettes, the succulent hearts of kinswomen. Thank you, Dan.
That's a great one, and a great way to end with some good poetry. We can some good succulent poetry, good words to end. I can't help it. I'm sorry, people. Thank you so much, Tim Conroy, with us. This is the lead off for 3 events, trifecta with Tim here at the Waccamaw Library, starting with the great Santini, and then going to a wonderful talk tomorrow morning, and then a writing workshop entitled Saying the Great Yes. So he's going to get some writers going on their own path, as he has done successfully. So it's always a pleasure to have Tim here, and we hope you'll come back again. You are definitely among, I won't say you're our favorite Conroy, but you're in the top 10. We'll give you that. No.
There's 10 left. That's perfect.
There. Yes. No, you are. You're definitely the youngest of the Conroys, the siblings at least. We'll give you that, and the best looking.
Okay.
No, thank you so much to Tim, and for that. That is it for today. In the Stacks by the Sea.
In the Stacks by the Sea.
And we decided an Anapest for our poetry lovers out there. Good day.
You're my